December 16, 1944. By the winter of that year, many Allied commanders believed the war in Western Europe had entered its final stage. Paris had been liberated months earlier, German forces had been pushed back across France, and the once unstoppable Wehrmacht appeared exhausted after months of continuous retreat. Intelligence estimates suggested that Germany simply lacked the fuel, manpower, and equipment necessary to launch another major offensive. Most planners expected isolated counterattacks designed only to slow the Allied advance toward the Rhine. Few believed Hitler still possessed the ability to change the course of the campaign. Among the quietest sectors of the front stood the Ardennes, a region of steep hills, dense forests, and narrow roads stretching across Belgium and Luxembourg. The difficult terrain made large-scale armored operations seem impractical, especially in the middle of winter. For that very reason, many experienced officers considered it the safest place to rest inexperienced divisions recovering from previous battles. Before dawn on December 16th, that assumption collapsed. Without warning, thousands of German artillery pieces opened fire across the frozen landscape. Under the cover of darkness, heavy fog, and falling snow, nearly 200,000 German soldiers surged forward alongside almost 1,000 tanks and assault guns. It was the largest offensive Germany had launched in the West since Normandy. Hitler's objective reached far beyond winning another battle. He intended to split the British and American armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into negotiating an end to the war. If successful, Germany could shift its remaining strength eastward against the Soviet Union. It was an extraordinary gamble, but one built upon a simple calculation. The Germans believed the weather would ground Allied aircraft, confusion would slow headquarters, and no American commander could possibly react fast enough to stop the breakthrough before it reached its objective. At first, everything unfolded exactly as they had planned. The opening hours of the offensive were devastating. Thinly held American positions disappeared beneath a storm of artillery before many soldiers even understood what was happening. Telephone lines were cut almost immediately. Radio traffic became increasingly chaotic, and headquarters struggled to determine where the main German attack was falling. Entire units found themselves surrounded by enemy armor emerging from forests that had been considered impassable only days earlier. Snow-covered roads filled with retreating vehicles, engineers rushed to destroy bridges before German spearheads could seize them, and military police fought desperately to prevent complete traffic paralysis. The carefully organized Allied front began to bend, then fracture. Every hour of uncertainty allowed German columns to push deeper into Belgium, widening the gap between neighboring American formations. At the center of Hitler's plan stood one small Belgian crossroads town that barely appeared on most civilian maps. Bastogne possessed no great factories, no major fortifications, and no political importance. Yet 7 primary roads converged there, making it the most important transportation hub in the entire region. Any army attempting to advance rapidly through the Ardennes would eventually need those roads to move fuel, ammunition, reinforcements, and heavy equipment. German planners understood that capturing Bastogne quickly would allow their armored divisions to maintain momentum toward the Meuse River and eventually Antwerp. Leaving it in American hands, however, risked creating a dangerous obstacle directly in the path of the offensive. Within days, the town became one of the most valuable objectives on the Western Front. Neither side could yet know that the battle for those frozen crossroads would soon depend on a decision being made more than 100 kilometers away by a commander whose army was still fighting in an entirely different direction. Far to the south, however, the situation looked completely different. General George S. Patton's Third Army was not rushing toward Belgium or preparing to defend against the German breakthrough. It was attacking east toward the Saar, one of Germany's heavily fortified industrial regions. Every element of the army pointed in that direction. Tank battalions were deployed along the eastern front. Artillery batteries had registered targets miles ahead. Fuel dumps and ammunition depots had been established to support continued offensive operations, while engineers were preparing crossings for rivers that lay nowhere near the Ardennes. Reversing such an operation was far more complicated than simply changing direction on a map. It meant redirecting hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, thousands of tons of fuel and ammunition, and an entire communications network built to support an advance in exactly the opposite direction. Inside Allied headquarters, few commanders believed such a maneuver could even be attempted. Military doctrine offered little encouragement. Armies did not simply stop in the middle of an offensive, rotate 90 degrees, and launch another major attack within days. Even under ideal conditions, reorganizing formations of that size required careful planning, new supply routes, revised artillery positions, and countless hours of coordination. winter only made the challenge greater. Snow-covered narrow roads, ice slowed heavy trucks, and fuel consumption increased dramatically. Any large redeployment risked creating traffic jams stretching for miles, leaving entire divisions stranded before they reached the battlefield. From the German perspective, these logistical realities were just as important as tanks or infantry. Their offensive depended on one assumption above all others. By the time the Allies assembled enough combat power to respond, Bastogne would already have fallen, and the breakthrough would be too deep to stop. What they did not know was that one American commander had already begun thinking several moves ahead before anyone had even asked him to act. By the evening of December 18th, reports arriving from the Ardennes painted an increasingly alarming picture. German armored spearheads had driven far deeper than Allied planners believed possible. American units were fighting isolated battles across frozen forests, and Bastogne was rapidly becoming the center of the crisis. Every hour mattered. If the crossroads fell, German supply columns would gain access to the road network needed to sustain the offensive toward the Meuse. The question facing Allied commanders was no longer whether they should respond, but whether anyone possessed the ability to respond quickly enough. Most believed the answer was no. General Patton reached a different conclusion. Even before receiving formal orders, he called his senior staff together and instructed them to stop thinking only about the offensive toward the Saar. Instead, he wanted plans for an entirely new operation, one that could send the Third Army north at a moment's notice. His chief of staff, Major General Hugh Gaffey, and Operations Officer Brigadier General Hobart Gay immediately understood what Patton was asking. This was not a request for rough ideas or emergency notes scribbled onto a map. He wanted complete operational plans with designated routes, marching schedules, fuel priorities, artillery assignments, engineer support, and alternative road networks. More remarkably, he did not ask for one plan. He ordered 3 separate versions, each designed for a different battlefield situation, so that whatever decision Supreme Headquarters reached, the Third Army would already be prepared to move. Throughout the night, Headquarters transformed into a planning factory. Officers compared maps, recalculated distances, identified bridges capable of supporting heavy armor, and assigned priorities to every major road leading toward Luxembourg and Bastogne. Telephone operators worked continuously as logistics officers coordinated fuel deliveries while engineers estimated how quickly damaged roads could be repaired if traffic became congested. By sunrise, hundreds of individual decisions had already been made, despite the fact that no official order to change direction had yet been issued. Patton understood something many commanders did not. The fastest army was rarely the one that moved first. It was the one that finished preparing before everyone else realized preparation had become necessary. December 19, 1944. In the ancient city of Verdun, a place already associated with one of the bloodiest battles in modern history, the senior Allied commanders gathered to confront a crisis that threatened the entire Western Front. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower listened as reports from the Ardennes grew darker by the hour. German armor continued pushing west. American units were being forced back across multiple sectors, and Bastogne was now effectively surrounded. The atmosphere inside the conference room reflected exhaustion, uncertainty, and the growing realization that the German offensive was far larger than anyone had predicted 3 days earlier. One by one, commanders described the forces available to contain the breakthrough, but every estimate pointed toward the same conclusion. Any major counterattack would require time the Allies did not possess. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton and asked the question that had brought him to Verdun. How quickly could the Third Army attack north? Several officers expected a cautious answer measured in weeks or at least many days. Patton answered almost immediately. He said he could attack with 3 divisions within 48 hours. The room fell silent. To most of the generals present, the claim sounded impossible. Patton's army was still engaged in offensive operations to the east. Its supply system pointed in the wrong direction, and winter conditions were worsening by the hour. One commander reportedly stared at him in disbelief. Eisenhower himself hesitated before replying that if Patton could do it in 72 hours, it would already be extraordinary. What the others did not yet know was that Patton had not come to Verdun to begin planning. He had come after planning was already largely complete. While the conference debated what might be possible, his staff had spent the previous night preparing the roads, schedules, artillery movements, fuel priorities, and command arrangements required for the turn north. Patton was not improvising under pressure. He was revealing work that had already been done. In that moment, the meeting ceased to be a discussion about whether the Third Army could move. It became a race to see whether it could move before the Germans realized the impossible was already underway. Leaving the conference, Patton wasted no time. There was no need for another planning session, no stack of fresh orders waiting to be written, and no lengthy debate between headquarters. Everything essential had already been prepared. Reaching a telephone, he delivered the brief, pre-arranged instruction his staff had been waiting for. Within minutes, signals spread through the Third Army headquarters, activating plans that had existed only on paper the night before. Across eastern France and Luxembourg, thousands of officers opened sealed movement schedules, engineers received new bridge assignments, military police moved toward key intersections, and logistics units began redirecting fuel and ammunition north instead of east. An army that had awakened expecting to continue its offensive toward the Saar was now preparing to fight an entirely different battle. The scale of the maneuver was almost impossible to comprehend. More than 133,000 vehicles had to be redirected onto unfamiliar roads already covered with snow and ice. Thousands of tanks, half-tracks, trucks, ambulances, artillery tractors, and fuel convoys competed for narrow mountain highways never designed to handle such traffic. Nearly 63,000 tons of supplies had to follow the advancing formations, while communications units rewired an enormous network that stretched for thousands of miles. Artillery battalions calculated entirely new firing positions, engineers inspected bridges that only hours earlier had held little strategic importance, and quartermasters reorganized supply dumps before the first columns even reached them. Every hour saved at headquarters translated into another mile gained on the road. The movement itself became a race against both weather and time. Snow reduced visibility, freezing temperatures caused vehicles to break down, and traffic jams threatened to delay entire divisions. Military police stood at major crossroads day and night, directing endless streams of trucks toward their assigned routes. Engineers cleared disabled vehicles from icy roads while mechanics repaired engines in temperatures well below freezing. Patton refused to supervise the operation from the comfort of headquarters. He drove between columns, inspected road junctions personally, and demanded that every obstacle be removed immediately. Soldiers later recalled seeing the general standing beside frozen intersections, urging drivers forward and refusing to tolerate unnecessary delays. He understood that every minute lost on the road brought the Germans 1 minute closer to securing Bastogne. The battle would ultimately be decided by tanks and infantry, but first it had to be won by planning, discipline, and an army moving faster than anyone believed possible. As the endless columns pushed north, Patton focused on one objective above all others: speed. He had long believed that momentum could decide battles before the first shot was fired, and now every hour carried enormous strategic value. Reports from Bastogne grew more alarming with each passing day. German forces had completed the encirclement, and the 131st Airborne Division, reinforced by scattered armored and engineer units, was now isolated inside the town. Ammunition was being rationed, medical supplies were running dangerously low, and winter weather prevented Allied aircraft from delivering meaningful support. German commanders assumed the defenders had only two realistic choices: surrender or be destroyed before outside help could arrive. Everything depended on whether the Third Army could reach the crossroads before that happened. Patton refused to allow the march north to slow. Whenever traffic stalled, he appeared where the problem was greatest. Soldiers later recalled seeing the general standing beside frozen intersections, directing military police, questioning officers about delays, and even helping push stalled trucks clear of icy roads. It was not theater. Patton understood that one disabled fuel truck blocking a narrow road could halt hundreds of vehicles behind it. A delay measured in minutes at one crossroads could become hours by the time it reached the front of the column. His headquarters monitored the movement almost continuously, adjusting routes whenever congestion threatened to interrupt the advance. The operation resembled an enormous machine whose countless moving parts had to remain synchronized despite snow, ice, exhaustion, and constant uncertainty. There was another detail that later became one of the most famous stories of the campaign. Days earlier, frustrated by the relentless storms grounding Allied aircraft, Patton had asked the Third Army chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, to prepare a prayer asking for clear weather. More than 250,000 copies were printed and distributed throughout the army together with a Christmas message from the general. Some soldiers treated it as a gesture meant to raise morale, while others quietly folded the card into their pockets before continuing north. Patton himself believed that success required both careful preparation and a measure of faith. Whether coincidence or not, the weather was about to change, and with it, the battle itself. December 22nd brought another test for the defenders of Bastogne. Confident that the surrounded Americans had no realistic hope of relief, German commanders decided to offer them one final opportunity to surrender. Under a white flag, 2 German officers approached the American lines carrying a formal demand for capitulation. The message warned that continued resistance would result in the complete destruction of the garrison and unnecessary loss of life. Inside Bastogne, the situation was undeniably desperate. The defenders had endured days of constant artillery fire, freezing temperatures, shrinking medical supplies, and mounting casualties. Ammunition was carefully rationed, many soldiers lacked proper winter clothing, and the town remained completely encircled. From the German perspective, surrender appeared to be the only rational outcome. The demand eventually reached Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division. Tired after days of fighting, he reportedly reacted with a single word: nuts. Staff officers initially laughed, but the expression perfectly captured the mood inside headquarters. Rather than drafting a lengthy formal reply, they decided to send exactly that one word back to the German delegation. Confused by the response, the German officers asked for an explanation. An American officer simply informed them that it meant, in polite military language, they could go to hell. Within minutes, the envoys departed, and German artillery resumed pounding the town. The brief exchange would become one of the most famous moments of the Battle of the Bulge, symbolizing the determination of a force that had no intention of surrendering, regardless of the odds. The following morning, the battlefield changed in a way neither side could control. After days of heavy cloud cover, the skies above the Ardennes finally began to clear. For the first time since the offensive had started, Allied aircraft could operate in strength. Transport planes dropped desperately needed ammunition, food, fuel, and medical supplies into Bastogne, while fighter bombers attacked German armored columns, supply convoys, artillery positions, and road junctions throughout the region. The weather that had protected Hitler's offensive during its opening days now turned against it. German units already struggling with fuel shortages suddenly found themselves under constant attack from the air. At the same time, Patton's leading divisions were closing the distance from the south. The timetable on which the entire German operation depended was beginning to collapse. By December 24th, the German timetable had begun to unravel. The offensive that had opened with speed and surprise was now losing the momentum on which its entire success depended. Fuel shortages became increasingly severe. Roads clogged with damaged vehicles, and Allied fighter bombers, finally free to operate beneath clear skies, struck bridges, supply convoys, and armored columns from dawn until dusk. Every mile gained during the first days of the offensive had to be defended against growing American resistance. Yet Bastogne remained the greatest obstacle. As long as the town continued to resist, German forces could not safely use the surrounding road network to sustain their drive toward the Meuse. What had begun as a minor crossroads had become the hinge upon which the entire offensive now turned. South of the town, Patton's leading formations pushed forward through bitter winter conditions. The task of opening a corridor to Bastogne fell primarily to the 4th Armored Division under Major General Hugh Gaffey, with Combat Command R driving toward the small village of Essenois. Every kilometer was fiercely contested. German infantry occupied forests overlooking narrow roads, anti-tank guns covered likely avenues of approach, and armored reserves launched repeated counterattacks whenever American spearheads threatened to break through. Progress was measured not in dozens of miles, but in individual fields, frozen crossroads, and isolated farmhouses. Artillery fired almost continuously, clearing paths for advancing tanks while engineers struggled to keep roads open for the columns following behind. Patton had demanded speed, but the closer his army came to Bastogne, the more determined the German defense became. On December 26, after days of relentless fighting, the final assault began. Before the armored columns moved, American artillery unleashed a concentrated bombardment, firing more than 2,000 shells against German positions defending the approaches to Essenois. As the barrage crept forward, Sherman tanks advanced so closely behind the explosions that they were almost driving through their own curtain of fire. It was an extraordinarily dangerous tactic, leaving defenders only seconds to recover before American armor was upon them. Resistance remained fierce, but the German line finally began to crack. By late afternoon, the leading tanks pushed beyond the village and continued toward the outskirts of Bastogne. For the first time since the encirclement began, the soldiers inside the town could hear the unmistakable sound of American tanks approaching from the south. Looking back, it is easy to remember the Battle of the Bulge through its most famous moments. The stubborn defense of Bastogne, the single-word reply of nuts, the arrival of Cobra King. Those moments deserve their place in history. But they tell only part of the story. Long before the first American tank reached the town, the outcome had already begun to change inside a headquarters where maps were spread across tables, routes were recalculated, and plans were prepared before anyone had officially asked for them. Victory did not begin on the battlefield. It began with preparation. When the German offensive erupted through the Ardennes, Hitler believed he had found the Allies' greatest weakness. Bad weather grounded their aircraft, surprise shattered their front lines, and simple military logic suggested that no commander could halt one offensive, rotate an entire army 90 degrees, and launch another attack in less than 3 days. On paper, the calculation was almost flawless. In reality, it failed because one commander refused to wait for events to dictate his decisions. While others were still assessing the crisis, George Patton had already begun preparing for it. The relief of Bastogne was not simply a victory of tanks, artillery, or brave infantrymen. It was the result of preparation before orders, speed beyond enemy expectations, and the willingness to strike where the opponent believed no attack was possible. Those three principles transformed what appeared to be an impossible mission into one of the most remarkable operational maneuvers of the Second World War. Even German commanders later acknowledged what they had witnessed. General Günther Blumentritt described Patton as the Allies' most aggressive armored commander. Alfred Jodl compared him to Heinz Guderian. Their respect was earned not because Patton fought the largest battle, but because he solved the hardest problem. History remembers great victories through dramatic photographs and famous quotations. Yet behind many of those moments stood commanders who had already won the decisive battle long before the shooting reached its climax. Bastogne was one of those moments. The road to the town was opened by tanks, but the path to victory had been laid days earlier by preparation, decisive leadership, and the courage to act before anyone else believed it could be done. If you enjoyed this story, consider leaving a like so more people can discover the overlooked decisions that shaped history. Subscribe for more carefully researched stories about the commanders, strategies, and turning points that changed the course of World War II. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.